Okay, we are recording. I'm going to take attendance, even though it's kind of a formality at this point, because the people online, I usually get a report from Google that says who was online, what time they logged in, and what time they logged off. Plus, you guys will still have to send me in the attendance words as usual, but I like to have backups. So, like I said, I'm going to do an attendance just in case maybe I don't get that report that I usually get. So, if I don't say your name, that means I didn't see you on the screen, which doesn't mean you're not here. So, correct me if I'm wrong, and let me know if you're here. Let me take one last look here. 2 others. All right. So, actually, let me do it like this. For a second, so I can see everybody. Okay. So Bryant is not here. He's probably upstairs. Curry, not here. Darby is online. Fisher is online. Hamilton is not here. Hellman, not here. Ashley is online. Crystal's online. Taylor's online. Norris, not here. Rollins, not here. Saunders is online. Shamblin is online. And Vargas is online. All right, so that takes care of that. Like I said, I'd like to get a slow start to this. Hey, there we go. So to remind you guys, of course, we only have 1 week of class left, but in the future, if you use your WVSU login, then you don't have to ask for permission to join, which right now it's not a problem because luckily we hadn't started the lecture. But if you try to join and the lecture's already started, sometimes I don't even notice and I can't let you in. So make sure you're signed into your WVSU accounts. Anyway, like I said, I apologize for this last-minute call. It was a perfect storm of things going wrong. Normally, I'm on campus about 7:10 to 7:12, somewhere around there, which gives me a lot of time to get things ready. And today, because of things at the house, I wasn't here until about 7:30, which should have been enough time. But I guess these problems in this H205 were just, even I couldn't fix it with that much time. So the camera wasn't working, the microphone wasn't working, and the projector wasn't working. So there was absolutely no need for us to meet in that room. And I apologize. But let me pull up this PowerPoint. We can get started. While I'm pulling it up, does anyone have any questions about anything in general? All right. Obviously, as a reminder, we do not have class next week because it is fall break. So that'll be the first word for attendance, fall. So as usual, you guys just email me these words within 5 minutes of the class being over. And if you're watching the video, email me the words, but also a screenshot that shows the word on the screen. But let's get back into it. We're back into chapter 20. And I'll remind you, too, because it could be confusing if you're reading your textbook, and you should be reading your textbook. I have this set up to where I'm using the PowerPoints the way that I have them laid out from the old textbook, because to me, the flow makes more sense. So I'm sticking with it. But the only reason you need to know that, and I'll remind you, there's a little bit of stuff from chapter 20, which is what we're doing now, that we covered in the last chapter, right? That last PowerPoint, chapter 19 PowerPoint, we had some chapter 20 material in here. And the other thing to remind you that I said on Wednesday is this PowerPoint for chapter 20, this is it for the rest of the semester. So on your textbook, there's chapter 20 and there's chapter 21. And all the pertinent information from both of those chapters is squeezed into this PowerPoint. So that being said, if there's no questions, let's jump into it. So to remind you, the last thing we were talking about was interspecific interactions, right? Because we're talking about community ecology. And community ecology, well, it's basically the study of a community, right? And the community is just a bunch of organisms, different populations that live together in the same area at the same time, competing for the same resources and things like that, right? So it's a bunch of different species interacting together. And the first thing we talked about, or the first overall topic I talked about with interspecific interactions, was interspecific competition. which is a negative negative, right? So it's bad for both species. Now we're talking about mutualism. Let's jump into mutualism. You'll notice here mutualism is a plus plus, right? It's good for both species. Or, as the book definition says, mutualism is when both species benefit. And that's basically what you need to know for the exam. I'm going to talk about it very quickly, but again, for the exam, it's pretty simple, right? Mutualism is good for both species. But there is like sort of a subcategory of mutualism, and this is when they are symbiotic, right? And when they're symbiotic, that means there's a close physical association. So yes, they're both both benefiting, but also there's a very close physical association. And one example from your old textbook is something called a symbiotic root fungus association, known as mycorrhizae. These are just examples. You don't need to know this, but it is a great example. So there are plants out there that have a certain fungus, there are certain species of plants that have certain species of fungus that grows on the roots, and they basically usually don't exist without each other, right? That species of fungus doesn't usually exist without that species of plant, and that species of plant doesn't usually exist without that species of fungus. And if they do, you know, there's situations where, yeah, sure, they may exist without each other, but they don't really thrive like they normally would. But anyway, back to this example. Again, it's mutualism, so both of them are getting something out of the deal. And in this case, the fungus delivers mineral nutrients to the plants, right? Because the plants need some mineral nutrients that we'll actually talk about later. And in return, the fungus gets organic nutrients from the plant. Specifically, as you might imagine, carbohydrates, right? Because we know the plants go through photosynthesis and produce glucose and other carbohydrates, and that's what the fungus could use. Because the fungus, just like every other living thing, needs to break down, well, almost every other living thing needs to break down carbohydrates to make ATP, right? So then questions about this so far? There's another example of mutualism on the next slide, but are there any questions so far? All right. Corals depend, this is the other example, some corals depend on algae that live inside the cells of each coral polyp. So here, I know it's kind of hard to see, especially if you're not familiar with coral, but this thing we're looking at is like probably one organism of coral. And these are just like little, I don't want to call them tentacles, but that's the best way to describe them in this course, like little tentacles growing off. But what you can't see, and you can kind of see it if you look very closely, these little bitty dots. And those little bitty dots are algae living inside the coral. So in this case, as you might imagine, it's kind of the same situation as the last, in that this photosynthetic organism is providing carbohydrates, right? It's providing sugars that the algae can use. Meanwhile, the algae, just like all animals, is producing waste, right? Some sort of ammonia waste, basically for us, pee, right? All animals produce some sort of pee, so to speak. So, you know, the algae can use that because, as you're going to learn later, and as I mentioned before, I've hinted around at it, photosynthetic organisms need nitrogen and phosphorus, or two of the big ones that they need. So they can get it from the waste products of the algae. Again, though, let me put it next to this to indicate this is just an example. I'm not going to ask you any questions about the relationship between coral and algae. Are there any questions about mutualism? Because now we're done talking about mutualism. Again, it's a situation in which both species benefit from the relationship. If you download the PowerPoint, you can watch this little video about clownfish and sea anemones. If I remember correctly, there was even a little bit of it in the movie Finding Dory, or was it the Finding Nemo, or maybe even both. But anyway, you can watch a little video if you want. If there's no questions about that, let's move into predation. Here we go. This one's pretty easy. You guys have probably heard this before. This should be nothing new. Predation, right? That's when there's a predator eating something else, right? And you should know that for the exam. Predation is when one species kills and eats another. Very simple, right? And the species that's doing the killing is called the predator. That species that's doing the killing, or excuse me, that's getting killed, is called the prey. And of course, as you probably might imagine, and most middle schoolers and probably even a lot of elementary schoolers too would probably know this if you ask them, this is good for one species and bad for the other, right? So it's a plus negative relationship. And that's basically it. That part's easy, right? The part that gets a little bit more complicated is when we talk about some of these adaptations that that the prey have evolved to avoid the predators, and then therefore some other adaptations of predators have evolved to better catch the prey. So let's talk about that very quickly, if there are no slides, or excuse me, are no questions so far. Actually, before we move forward, the next word for attendance is lion, like the animal lion, not like the Eagle song "Lion Eyes." Lying. We're talking about a lion. Anyway, let's move forward if there's no questions. Actually, let me also quickly make sure that I'm still recording and still here. Okay. I've done that before back in COVID when I was working in front of my computer and not in a classroom. I gave a whole lecture just to find out it quit recording like 5 minutes in, and nobody was there. I was just talking to myself, and it wasn't recording. That was very annoying. Anyway, here we go. Some examples of some things that some adaptations. The first one is speed, right? So obviously, some examples of this are antelope outrunning predators, rabbits being able to run fast enough to get some shelter. There's a lot of examples of prey evolving ways to basically outpace the predators. And I drew an X to that, indicating that, again, those are just examples. You do not need to memorize the examples. I might give you some hypothetical example on the exam, and you'd recognize that and say, oh, yeah, that's a speed adaptation. There's other adaptations, and I'm sure you're very aware of this. The two examples that your old book gives are porcupines' sharp quills and clams' hard shells, right? You could just, there's so many out there, a turtle's hard shell, scorpion sting, all these things. Of course, that's a little bit more than mechanical. There's also chemistry involved there. But point is, there are mechanical structures that animals have evolved to avoid being eaten. Any questions about that? All right. Another very obvious one that you guys are probably already familiar with is camouflage, aka cryptic coloration. Right? It makes finding the prey difficult. Like if you look at this picture here, it's a bunch of coral, and then there's this one little seahorse hanging out, and it blends right in, right? Which is perfect when you're trying to hide from something trying to eat you. Here's some other examples. You can see a spider right here. You can see a frog right here, because that frog is a little bit more visible. But again, cryptic coloration, right? Camouflage, just a way to blend in so you're not seen and eaten by predators. If you download the PowerPoint, you can watch this little video, a short little video that shows you the same little seahorses that I just circled. All right, and here we're still talking about adaptations to avoid getting eaten. And the next one we're going to talk about is warning coloration. Those are bright patterns of yellow, red, or orange with black marks, right? And this identifies animals with effective chemical defenses. Usually, that's what that little thing's for. Usually, that's what it means. And I'll give you the exceptions here in a second. But generally speaking, the warning coloration tells the predator, hey, this thing is, it's either dangerous, or deadly at worst, or bad tasting at best, right? So eventually, predators learn to avoid these things because they recognize these color patterns, right? So even if maybe some predator had eaten a frog like this and got really, really sick, and then saw a different species of frog, but didn't have similar color patterns, it would still recognize that color pattern in theory and avoid it. So any questions about warning coloration? This is all pretty simple stuff. All right, but like I said, there are some exceptions, right? It's not, these warning colorations do not always indicate that the animal has effective chemical defenses. Instead, sometimes it's something called mimicry. And again, this is something that you might need to know for the exam, not necessarily definition, but just like everything else I've been talking about so far today, I would give you an example and you would recognize it and say, oh, yeah, that's mimicry. So mimicry is a copycat adaptation, which is when one species basically looks like another, or in other words, because no species, remember, we know how evolution works, right? No species decided to look this way. So a better way of saying one species looks like another, it's better to say it's 1A. Let me back up here. A species that doesn't have effective chemical defenses, it's when the species that doesn't have that looks like that it does, right? But yes, in some cases, one species does look like another, and your book gives this example. So here we have, let's see, red on black, friend of Jack, red on yellow, kill a fellow. That's how I remember it. Okay, so this is a king snake right here, right? And this is a coral snake right here. And you can see how they look similar, and that would very often confuse a predator, because they would see, this harmless king snake and be like, oh, that thing looks poisonous. Again, it's an animal. It's not a human, so it's probably not using a verbal thinking, but it probably recognizes these color patterns and says, oh, that's, thinks that's dangerous. I'll stay away from it. Any questions so far? Again, we're still talking about adaptations to avoid being eaten. Okay, so let's talk about some other stuff. There's kind of along the lines of camouflage is disguises, right? In a sense, it is kind of camouflage, but it's a little bit more specific. Instead of just blending in, some of these animals are actually meant to look like other things. So, as your book mentions, or some insects resemble twigs, leaves, bird droppings. I'm sure you've seen a lot of these before. And some imitate vertebrates, right? So we have some insects, right, which are invertebrates, and sometimes they imitate vertebrates. So, for example, on the next slide, I'll show you a picture of this. There's a caterpillar who, on the dorsal side, which is like the back, right, the back side of it, it's camouflage, right? So it's meant to blend in when it's just doing its normal thing and its back is exposed. That's meant to blend in. But then if it gets threatened, it flips over and it reveals its ventral side, right? So its belly, if you will. And it reveals snake-like eye spots. And I'll just show you. And again, this is just an example, so no need to memorize this. But here's what I'm talking about, right? So the one on the left is the caterpillar that has flipped over to make itself look like a snake. And of course, here we have an actual snake on the right. So again, that's just a really interesting example of, in this case, this is camouflage. And when it flips over, it's also kind of a case of trying to disguise itself as another creature. So any questions about predation or adaptations to avoid predation? All right, this is probably pretty easy stuff, right? Most of us grew up watching nature shows and things like that and probably have seen these discussions. The next one is very similar. Next thing we're going to talk about is herbivory, which is basically the same as predation, except instead of an animal eating an animal, it's an animal eating a plant, right? Herbivory is the consumption of plant parts or algae by an animal, right? So basically, I guess you could also reword that to say it's when an animal eats something that's photosynthetic, right? And again, as you might imagine, usually, but not always, usually it's good for one species and bad for the other. Now, there are some examples where, especially when we're talking about eating fruit and dispensing seeds, in that case, herbivory is usually, and I wish we had more time to talk about it, in that case, herbivory could be a plus because the animal that eats the fruit, it gets the benefit from that. And then it leaves that plant, travels around a little bit, poops out the seeds. So therefore, it has spread the seeds for that plant, and in which case it would be also a plus for the plant. But this isn't an ecology class, so we don't get that deep into it. So let's just focus on the basic idea of herbivory, again, which is when an animal eats something that's photosynthetic. Your book points out that it's usually not fatal, but usually still bad, right? Because plants need leaves, for example, to live, and the more leaves you take off of it, generally speaking, the harder it is for it to live. But again, and then the same way we had a discussion in the last section when we were talking about predation, we were talking about adaptations to avoid predation. Well, the same thing here. Plants have also evolved defenses to avoid herbivory. And we're going to talk about these moving forward, but on this this bullet point, really quickly, I'll just mention, there's spines, thorns, trichomes, which are like little hairs on plants, and chemical toxins, sort of like poison ivy, right? But are there any questions so far before I give you some more examples of this bullet point right here? All right, well, the next word for attendance, I'm going to box it in. So I'm not going to say it. I'm boxing it in right now. That's the next word for attendance. So, again, if you're on here live right now, send me that word at the end of the lecture. If you're watching the video, send that screenshot. Anyway, let's get back to some examples. And again, these are obviously, as always, just examples. You don't need to memorize this list. Besides, I mean, it's like the same way I usually do things. I don't want you to memorize things. I want you to understand them. So for the exam, if I give you an example of a way to avoid herbivory, you just need to recognize it, right? But anyway, some examples are like the thorny rose bush or a spiky cactus, or the poison produced by a tropical vine, or a better example for that for us, since we're probably more familiar with it, is poison ivy, right? Poison produced by poison ivy is a great example. That's a chemical defense. Morphine from opium, which is interesting, right? Because you might not think of it, but the plant evolved that to avoid being eaten. And then humans came around and were like, hey, kind of like the way that feels. Let's turn this into a drug, right? Same thing with nicotine, right? So the nicotine in tobacco was meant as a defense. And then again, humans came around like, hey, I kind of like the way that defense feels. So let's grow this so we can smoke it and chew it and things like that. Actually, and that's what this next bullet point gets to. There's actually a lot of examples of this, and this next slide's from your old textbook. The peppermint, right? That strong flavor of peppermint that a lot of humans love. Well, that strong flavor was, again, it was meant to have keep animals from eating it. Same with cloves, right? So strong flavor of cloves. Same with cinnamon. That's a strong flavor. Hot peppers, right? That's another thing. Peppers are hot because that's a way to avoid getting eaten, right? But these are all things that are, in this case, that humans have come to enjoy. Which makes you wonder, on one hand, you might say natural defense failed them in that sense, right? Because like, hey, I'm doing this to avoid being eaten. And then humans are like, hey, I love to eat this or smoke this or whatever the case may be. So in one case, again, you might say that natural solution failed. But on the other hand, you might say it's actually helped them, right? Because we love these things, we grow peppermint and we grow cloves and we grow cinnamon and tobacco and opium and THC and hot peppers, all these things that were meant to avoid herbivory. Humans liked them, so because of that, we've kept these plants around and we protect them when we grow them. So in a sense, it has kind of helped them. But anyway, those are just examples. Are there any questions about herbivory or adaptations to avoid herbivory? All right, the next thing we're going to talk about then is parasites and pathogens. Basically diseases, if you will. What is a parasite? You need to know this for the exam. It is something that lives in or on a host from which they obtain their nutrients. So, for example, you've got, I don't know if you've seen these nature documentaries, and they have those birds that live on top of the water buffaloes, and they eat the insects that are on the water buffaloes. That's more of a mutualism situation because the buffalo benefits from getting the insects eaten off of it, and the bird, gets the free meal and probably a little bit of protection. So even though that organism lived on the host, if you want to call it a host, I guess in this case you can't really call it a host, but anyway, the bird does live on that animal, but it's not a parasite situation because it's not obtaining the nutrients from the water buffalo, right? It's obtaining those nutrients from the insects, like the flies that are landing on the water buffalo. But anyway, here we go. Back to what we need to know for the exam. Obviously, as you might imagine, in this situation, this is a plus minus, right? Generally speaking, it's good for the parasite and bad for the host, right? Because again, the parasite gets all these free nutrients and the host is providing them. Some examples, and this is so many examples. I had a whole course on this, I think, as a graduate student. So tapeworms, roundworms, ticks, lice, mosquitoes, right? all these things you can think of where they're getting a host, getting nutrients from a host. And I wish there was more time for independent work because some of these are actually quite interesting. For example, what is it? Is it hookworms? I think it's hookworms. The way the hookworm life cycle works is, well, I guess I'll start from the beginning. It's a cycle, really. So, it could, in any cycle, there's no really beginning because it circles, right? Anyway, when it rains, there's little hookworms that have been dormant in the soil and they become active and they start, I don't know how to explain it. They go erect, right? So they're trying to like reach up into the sky, so to speak, when it rains. And then when people walk barefooted, then they go in through the feet of humans, right? In through the flesh. And they basically travel up through your flesh into your lungs. And then when they get into your lungs, that's where they lay their eggs. And then what happens is, again, they've laid their eggs inside your lungs. And then you start coughing, you develop a cough. And then what happens is you cough like that, cover your mouth, keep your mouth closed. And then because you've done that, you now have the eggs in your mouth. So what do? I mean, you don't know you don't have, you don't feel them or taste them. So you just do what you normally do. You swallow. So then the eggs go again from your lungs to your mouth. Now they're going to your gut. You poop them out. You poop the eggs out. They land on the ground and the cycle continues. So I like that example. One, because it's really gross. And two, and I find this interesting too, there was, it turned out that people who chew tobacco were less likely to pass along this parasite because they were used to spitting a lot. So when they coughed those eggs up from their lungs to their mouth, rather than swallow them and put them back into their stomach and continue the cycle, they'd spit them out. And that would kill them. Anyway, that's just an example. I thought it was interesting. There's a lot of interesting parasite examples, interesting and gross, but as always, you don't need to know the examples. I would give you some hypothetical example that I haven't taught you about, or maybe make up some hypothetical example. And then you'd have to recognize it as a situation with parasites. So any questions about parasites? All right. So then we talk about pathogens. And again, pathogens are basically just things that cause diseases like bacteria, viruses, fungi, protists. Obviously, they have to cause bacteria to be considered pathogens. For example, you consist of more bacteria cells than human cells, right? There's all bacteria all inside of you and outside of you, and you need them, right? So it's not all bacteria are disease causing. Some of them are useful. And then also, speaking of which, some bacteria are good in some parts of your body, but bad in other parts, right? So I'm sure you guys have heard of E. coli. That comes from your guts, basically, and it's good. We need it there. But when it gets in other parts of your body, then you have a bacterial infection, right? So anyway, those are just examples. Actually, this is one thing you might memorize because those are pretty basic, right? Those aren't specific examples like a tapeworm or roundworm. Like this is pretty big stuff here. Pretty big categories of organisms: bacteria, fungi, protists, viruses, which aren't living, but right, those are pretty big categories. Kingdoms, right? These are all kingdoms: the bacteria kingdom, fungi kingdom, protist kingdom. But anyway, are there any questions about parasites or pathogens? All right. And again, I'll remind you too that it's so interesting to me. We've talked about some of this stuff before too, because we talked about mosquitoes, right? Because we talked about malaria. That's a disease caused by or spread by malaria. Spread by mosquitoes. And we talked about how sickle cell disease kind of helps you avoid malaria, and we talked about that in the context of natural selection. But anyway, let's move on to the next one, the last one, when we're talking about interspecific interactions, which is commensalism. Commensalism, it's not necessarily a plus plus, it's not a plus minus, it's more like a plus zero. This is when one species benefits and the other one is not harmed or helped at all, right? And the example here is a seahorse, right? It's the seahorse like that I showed you earlier with the camouflage. It benefits by matching coral to hide, right? So that really the coral is really helping the seahorse, right? As a matter of fact, that seahorse probably wouldn't survive without that particular species of coral. But the coral's really getting nothing from it, right? There's no benefits to the coral. So any questions about what commensalism is? All right, you guys are being really quiet and easy today. We're flying through this. So here's everything we talked about basically in one table. So if you're studying, I would recommend pulling this PowerPoint out, right? So yes, you have a textbook, and yes, these concepts come from your textbook. But if I remember correctly, your textbook doesn't have this neat little table that summarizes it all together. And again, I know everybody studies different and learns different, but for me, these are really good studying tools. When I can just visualize every important concept in one sitting, I really like it. But again, you can see here competition, bad for both, right? Mutualism, good for both. Exploitation or predation, basically, good for one, bad for the other. Herbivory, good for one, bad for the other. Parasites and pathogens, good for the others, or one, bad for the other. Let me also point this out because I didn't mention this. Technically, exploitation includes these things, right? Exploitation includes predation and herbivory and parasites and pathogens, right? Those three things are a subcategory of exploitation. I'm going to cross that out because I'm not going to use that word in the exam. So any questions about interspecific interactions? All righty. Let's move on and talk about trophic structure. You guys are probably familiar with this, the basics of this. Everyone learns this in elementary school, middle school, and high school. But now we're going to give it a few different words, and we're going to go into a little bit more depth. Or maybe not. If you had a really good biology class in high school, maybe you've already learned this. Trophic structures, you need to know what that is. That is the feeding relationships among the species in a community, often called a food chain or a food web, which we'll discuss later. Right? So it's the feeding relationships, like who eats who, or what is the proper way to say that? Who eats whom? It's which species eats which species. That is the trophic structure. The trophic structure determines the passage of energy and nutrients from plants to herbivores to predators. And I put this little star here because I am describing a terrestrial ecosystem in this bullet point. But if we were talking about an aquatic ecosystem, then I might say a trophic structure determines the passage of energy and nutrients from algae to herbivores to predators, right? So, but it's the same concept, right? Photosynthetic creatures is where the energy starts, the energy and the matter and the nutrients, right? It all starts from the photosynthetic organisms, and then the things that eat those, and the things that eat those things, so on and so forth. Are there any questions so far? All right. So like I said, this bullet point I showed, this middle bullet point here, kind of shows you is a basic description of a terrestrial ecosystem. But this slide here, we've got kind of an example of both, right? So we have terrestrial ecosystem on the left, aquatic ecosystem on the right. I'll put a big old X to this because, again, these are just examples, right? And nowhere, I'm not going to give you a question like, is an orca, is it a quaternary consumer or a tertiary consumer or a secondary consumer or a primary consumer or a primary? Like, I'm not going to ask you that, right? Not to memorize. Now, I might say something like a rattlesnake eats a mouse, and the mouse eats the grasshopper, which eats, the flower. In that case, you will need to recognize it, and then I might say, what is the rattlesnake? And based on that description I just gave you, that this thing eats this thing, which eats this thing, which eats this thing, then you should recognize it as a tertiary consumer. That being said, on the next slide is when I'm actually going to talk a little bit more about details and give you this information, the difference between these things. But I just wanted to point that out there. As always, you don't need to know these specific examples. That in the exam, when I explain a concept to you and explain a situation to you, you should be able to recognize these things. But anyway, back to the PowerPoint, the words on the PowerPoint. The level that supports all the other levels are called producers. You do need to know that, right? These are called producers. The bottom of the food chain, those are called producers. And you learned that way back when we started first talking about photosynthesis and respiration, right? I told you this would come back, and here it is, it's coming back. So the first portion is called producers. Everything above that are called consumers. And again, you learned all of this in the previous chapter when we talked about photosynthesis and respiration. And you also learned these terms too. Producers are autotrophs, right? And consumers are called heterotrophs. These are not new concepts. We learned this earlier in the semester. Are there any questions about this slide? All right, let's talk about this idea of primary consumer, secondary consumer, tertiary consumer, so on and so forth. That'll be on this slide. Then the next word for attendance. Oh, here we go. Make this interesting. I'm going to circle it, and you tell me what it is. Now, you might not think what I think it is. That's okay. I just want to see the different answers. As long as it's not something stupid like a whale or a UFO, right? We can all see what that kind of is. So just for your next attendance word, tell me what you think that thing is right there. Anyway, and no, the answer is not, do not write top carnivores or tertiary consumers, right? Anyway, here we go. Back to the stuff that you need to know for the exam. Herbivores, like we said already, let's start right here, even though it's not on the slide. Like we said, we've got the primary producers, right? Which is almost redundant. They're just producers, right? We can just think of them as producers. These are things that are photosynthetic, i.e., they are autotrophs, right? So that's our primary producers. Above that, we have our primary consumers, right? Primary consumers are herbivores. Those are the things that eat the plants. Above the primary consumers, we have the things that eat them. Those are called secondary consumers, right? Secondary consumers eat the primary consumers. Then obviously the next thing we have above that are tertiary consumers. Tertiary consumers eat secondary. And occasionally, if there's enough energy and matter in the ecosystem, there's even quaternary consumers that eat the tertiary. And again, basically for the exam, I'm going to give you some example. I'm going to describe something and say something like, there's a snake that eats a squirrel that eats the acorns from an oak tree. What is the snake? And you're like, all right, well, okay, the oak tree is the primary producer. The squirrel is the primary consumer. Therefore, the snake must be the secondary consumer, right? That's how that's going to work. Are there any questions about that? Should be pretty simple. What usually throws people off is this right here. These two, because they both start with primary, right? We have primary producers, primary consumers. Don't let that fool you. So there are no questions about this? Then let's talk about something we haven't talked about yet that's in this picture. What about all these little fellows, right? I haven't even mentioned them. There are some consumers that derive their energy from detritus, which is dead material left by all levels. So whether you're a primary producer, a primary consumer, secondary consumer, tertiary consumer, so on and so forth, no matter what, you're leaving dead material. Either A, when you die, or B, when you digest things and get rid of it. Or for humans, defecating, right? So there's a whole different trophic structure that lives off of dead stuff, whether it be, poop or literally things that have died. They are consumed in different stages of decay. From smaller to larger or larger to smaller, we have scavengers at the top. Here's some examples. And again, you don't need to necessarily memorize any of these examples. But scavengers consume carcasses, right? So when you see a dead deer on the side of the road and you can literally see an animal eating it, that would be a scavenger. Then there's detritivores. Those are things like earthworms and millipedes that consume dead or decaying materials. So for example, again, you're walking down the road, you see a dead deer, you see a bunch of vultures eating on it. As you get closer, the vultures fly away. You've seen scavengers. Then you look at the dead deer because you're walking up on it and you see a bunch of maggots in there, right? And worms and stuff. Those are detritivores, right? Then let's say you come back, 3 months later, and there's pretty much nothing there. There's a skeleton. And you can't see anything of what the deer used to be. It's there, but you can't see it other than the skeleton. But again, those nutrients are still there, and that's where the decomposers come in. Those are the usually, but not always, single cellular things, right? Almost naked to the eye, or invisible to the naked eye. And again, like your book says, they're usually prokaryotes, which again are, as far as we're concerned, bacteria, and fungi, right? So they secrete enzymes that digest the molecules and convert the organic material into inorganic forms. So that basically, that's the whole thing as far as trophic structures are concerned. We've now talked about all of them. And as you can imagine, this is a very important level, not detritus, but these things, these decomposers, these scavengers and detritivores and decomposers, these are all very important because without them, we wouldn't have these nutrients, right, that converts organic material into inorganic forms, right? We wouldn't have these nutrients back in the soil. Therefore, the producers, those plants and other photosynthetic organisms, couldn't live, right? They need these inorganic molecules to be able to live. And without them, the whole ecosystem collapses, right? Because those are the producers. So are there any questions about trophic structure? Here's a picture from your old textbook. Speaking of detritivores and things like that, that is, I don't know if you can tell, but that's a compost bin, right? So people will throw away their scraps and just basically let it decompose, right? Until it turns into soil, really rich soil, which is good for plants. Anyway, any questions about trophic structure so far? Again, we basically just finished talking about a food chain. All right, then. So on that note, while we're still kind of on the concept of food chains, let's talk about biological magnification. And if you've had Bio 108, this should be a review for you. So organisms cannot metabolize a lot of toxins, right? So that's one of the things that makes it, one of the things that often makes a toxin is because you can't metabolize it, meaning you can't break it down, right? If you eat a certain molecule, right, whatever molecule that toxin may be, it just stays there. It's harming you, and you can't break it down, right? Your body can't break it down, and that's one of the reasons it's toxic. So because of that, those chemicals remain in the body of the organisms that eat them. So what happens is, because of this, they become concentrated as they pass through the food chain, right? Basically, as they go up the food chain, or as they go up the pyramid that I just showed you, right? Or as they go up the trophic levels, they get biologically magnified. And I'll give you this as an example. So here we're talking about the particular toxin we're talking about is PCBs. Again, I'll just put a big old X through this because it's not important. But there's a small amount of PCBs, for example, in the water, right? So let's just say this is off the coast of Seattle, because you've all taken that, you've all done that lab, so you're very aware of this. There's a little bit of PCBs in the water. And here you have these zooplankton, which are basically filter feeders, right? So they get a little bit of PCBs in them, right? They get, for every 1 gram of their body, there's 1 nanogram. And I wish I had time to tell you how small that was. But anyway, point is, there's a little bit of PCBs in the bodies of these zooplankton. But the cod are eating the zooplankton, right? They're not filter feeding, so they're not getting the small amount that's in the water. They're getting the little bit larger amount that's actually in the bodies of these zooplankton. Therefore, they've got 10 nanograms per gram, right? And then these things are eating these things, right? The salmons are eating the cod. Therefore, it's getting even more concentrated. So they're getting 90 nanograms per gram. And this is why they say, for example, there's certain fish that pregnant and nursing women shouldn't eat. And this is why, or one of the reasons why, right? So at this point, for a human breast milk, there would be 350 nanograms per gram of PCBs. Now, you don't need to know how deadly PCBs are or what level they're the deadliest. But the point here that we're trying to illustrate is, as you move up the chain, right, it gets more and more concentrated. So are there any questions about this example? And again, I'm putting an X through here because it's an example. You do not need to memorize, this particular example of PCBs going through zooplankton, then cod, then salmon, then human breast milk. It's just an example. Are there any questions about biomagnification? Okay. Actually, I should point out too, just randomly, just so you know, even though I was talking about Seattle, this was actually used as an example for the Great Lakes. So you can see this is a problem that is all over the country. All right. The next thing we're talking about is food webs, because There are very few communities that are so simple that they're characterized by unbranched food chains. So far we've been talking about food chains, right? I showed you this thing eats this thing and this thing eats that thing, but that's very unrealistic, right? Like, how many instances do you know where there's only one species that eats one species up the whole chain, right? It's not usually like that. So let's talk about that. That's what a food web is. Another thing the food chains don't discuss are things called omnivores. So, right, the herbivores eat plants. Autotrophs produce their own food, right? Those photosynthetic organisms. What we haven't talked about so far are omnivores, right? Omnivores are things that eat producers and consumers. Or, as you're probably used to hearing it, omnivores eat plants and animals, basically. Any questions so far before I give you a visualization of this food web? All right. Here's an example. And this still, too, is a very simplified example of what a food web is. First of all, it's in a desert. So that in itself makes it more simplified because there's less biodiversity, right? Generally speaking. So there's less to illustrate anyway. And on the other hand, in addition to that, this is still oversimplified. So if we were looking at a desert ecosystem, this is still just a snapshot. There's still a lot of other species that aren't even included here. But the idea is still generally the same, right? We still have the producers. We still have the primary consumers that eat the producers, right? But we also have some of these, right? Some of these here are sometimes secondary consumers, but they're also sometimes primary consumers, depending on what they're eating, right? So, for example, this bird right here, it's eating a cactus, but according to these arrows, this bird could also eat that chipmunk or that mouse or this grasshopper, right? So again, this thing is on both the primary consumer and the secondary consumer. Then same here, right? We go up yet another trophic level, which should be the third level, the tertiary level. But again, there are some things in the tertiary level that also eat other stuff, right? So they can both be tertiary and secondary consumers, so on and so forth. The idea here is it's okay to think about things in the terms of a food chain, but just keep it in the back of your mind that it's not that simple. And in all actuality, things are more like a food web, right? It's a big web of complicated interactions. Anyway, yeah. Any questions about that? All right. So let's go back to this idea of biodiversity. We talked about it. That was the first thing we talked about in this chapter when we talked about the reasons biodiversity is declining and how important it is. We talked about how habitat destruction was the number one reason that we're losing biodiversity. But now let's actually talk about how we kind of define species diversity. Right. So, excuse me. Also, I'll remind you too, when we were talking about biodiversity, we talked about genetic diversity, we talked about species diversity, and we talked about ecosystem diversity, right, from smallest to largest. But now we're going to focus in again on species diversity on this PowerPoint, on this slide right here, this bullet point. Anyway, what is species diversity? You need to know this for the exam. Is the variety of species in a community. That's the first thing you need to know. And then you need to know there's two ways we describe it. The difference between the two. There's species richness, which is the number of different species in the community. And there's relative abundance, which is the proportional representation of each species. And I already gave this example when we first talked about biodiversity, but I'll give it again, and now it'll make more sense because I'm going to use these words, and hopefully you can remember. When we were all sitting in H2O5 together, I said, look around. The only species we can see in this room are humans, right? So that would be a species richness of 1. Hope that makes sense, right? I mean, granted, there are other species that we can't see, right? All the things living inside of us and out on the outside of us, and all the things living in the room. But anyway, as far as we could see, there was only humans in there. Now, imagine somebody brought 5 dogs with them, so that's another species. And then somebody brought 2 cats with them, that's another species. And someone brought 1 fish with them, that's another species. Right? So species richness is 4. But the relative abundance, let's just say instead of that instead of that day when there was only a handful of us, let's say there was 100 humans in that room. And in that case, there might be a species richness of 4, but when we're talking about relative abundance, it's still not a very diverse. I don't want to call it an ecosystem because it's in a classroom, but we'll call it that. Sure, it's not a very diverse ecosystem because there's 4 different species in the room, but there's only, most of them are humans, right? And there's a few of the other. So as a better example, let's look at this. So woodland A versus woodland B, and you might get a question like this on the exam, of like which one is more diverse. Now, if you look, woodland A's got what? 1, 2, 3, 4 different species of trees, right? So for species richness, it's 4. But if you look, most of these trees in here, or whatever this is called an oak tree, right? So yes, technically there's 4 species, but it's mostly this oak tree. Now, if you look at woodland B, here we go. 1, 2, 3, 4. We have the same 4 species, but you can see that the relative abundance is more equal, right? So this ecosystem, woodland B, is more biologically diverse than this ecosystem, at least when we're considering these trees. Of course, we don't see anything else. We don't see the animals or the fungi or any of the other plants, but from the information we've given in this picture, woodland B is more diverse than woodland A. And here's a graph of what we're talking about, right? Woodland B is more diverse than woodland A. So again, for the exam, those are just examples. I might describe that situation. I might give you a visual like we just saw, or I might describe it in words and then ask you, which ecosystem is more diverse, or which forest is more diverse, or which, I don't know, aquarium is more diverse. Whatever situation I use, you need to understand how biodiversity works. And again, understand the difference between species richness and species abundance. So are there any questions about those concepts? All right, that brings us to another important concept. It's called a keystone species. And this is a species whose impact is much larger than the total mass or abundance indicates. So before I talk about this in detail, let me back up again. So one might guess, and let's consider woodland A. One might look at this if they didn't know and say, oh, this oak species must be a keystone species because look, it's very important. There's a lot of them, right? There's a lot of those, so it must be very important. But that's not how a keystone species works. And that's why this is what it means when it says that its impact is larger than the total mass or abundance indicates. So again, in that last situation, in woodland A, you might say, oh yeah, that oak tree must be important because the total mass or abundance indicates that, but that's not how it works. Again, using this as an example, this one species right here might be a keystone species. It's usually not a plant, but the point is, there's very few of these trees. There's a lot of other trees, but it still might be really important to the ecosystem, even though there's only one of them. And here we go. Let's give you an actual example. Well, there's 2 examples. One of them's going to be visualized. The other one's going to be in words. So here's the first one. The first one's just in words. What we have here is there's a predator, which in this case is a sea star. They removed it from an ecosystem in an experiment, and its main prey, which are the mussels, outcompeted the other species for important resources. Therefore, the number of species present in that area, right, where they did this experiment went from over 15 species to less than 8. And this will make more sense when I show you a picture and give you a different example. But the point here is they removed one species from the ecosystem, just one, right? And then basically they cut the number of species in half because of it. And again, to understand the logic, it's because, well, when you get rid of the sea stars, then you get rid of the things that eat the mussels. Now, the mussels are out competing. Remember, we talked about this with the competitive exclusion principle, right? When species are together and they have the same niche or a similar niche, they compete with each other, and one usually outcompetes the other. But that's what predators are for, to help keep things balanced, right? So when the mussel population gets too high, then the sea star eats them. But now, because the sea stars are gone, and because of the competitive exclusion principle, right, these mussels are taking over. And again, because of that, they've outcompeted the other stuff, and now there's fewer than 8 species. Now, before I take any questions, let me give you a different example. This one I can visualize. This one, so what I just told you here, this was an experiment. This next one was basically, I don't think it was an experiment. I think it was basically people taking observations and seeing what happened. But here, in this case, the sea otter is the keystone species, right? Just one species. It's a top predator. So, relative abundance, there's not much of the sea otter compared to the other species around. But what happens is the sea otter eats these sea urchins, right? So once the sea otters were gone, these sea urchins basically ran the show, right? There's a lot of them. There's nothing to keep them in check. What do the sea urchins eat? The sea urchins eat kelp. So if you get rid of the otter, then you have a lot of sea urchin, therefore you get rid of the kelp. But what this picture doesn't show is there's all kinds of species of aquatic animals that live in the kelp, right? They need a place to hide. They need the kelp to eat. They need the kelp to lay their eggs, right? So because they got rid of the otter, and they got rid of, and again, this picture just shows the kelp gone, but all the other species that were living in the kelp are now gone just because you got rid of this one species, the otter. And then again, one last time before I take questions on this, this next slide actually should have been before this slide. This next slide visualizes the first example I gave you. So in an experiment, someone took some numbers, right? These were the species living, and it was just like a little pool, if I remember correctly. It was just a little pool on the Pacific coast, and they were looking at the biodiversity, and they took note of all the different species. Then they took away the sea stars, right? And then this is what was left. Because again, you get rid of the sea stars, then the sea star eats the mussels, which is the thing that outcompetes everything else. These mussels right here, right? So there's a lot more mussels now because the sea stars are around. There's a lot fewer of everything else. Anyway, are there any questions about keystone species? All right. And again, I want to point this out too, because I was kind of hinting at this or talking about this on Wednesday. This is why, to use the same term I've been using for a while, it's not just a tree hugging thing or save the whale thing. It's not always just about someone who loves nature and every species deserves to be around, which I agree with. But even if you don't subscribe to that, sometimes like one species can be really important, right? And again, to talk about what we talked about when we first started talking about biodiversity, this might not matter to you because you might be looking at this like, well, who cares? I don't live in this pool in the Pacific Northwest, right? What's it matter? But remember, like I was talking about with biodiversity, this is important because we need the more species in an ecosystem, generally speaking, the better, because it's more biodiverse, and then the ecosystem can function the way it needs to. And again, that is not a tree hugging concept because we need ecosystems to do what they do for our very survival, right? So it is, again, literally a matter of life and death. Not to say that if you go to one pool in the Pacific Northwest and remove the starfish and this happens, that we're all going to die, right? That's not what I'm saying. I'm not saying it's a matter of immediate life or death for every little thing that we do wrong. I'm saying overall, the big picture, this is not, it is an important concept. Anyway, any questions about this before we move forward? All right, the next word for attendance will be that sea star or starfish, whichever one you want to use. Sea star or starfish is the next word for attendance. We got 2 minutes left. Let's talk about this. Disturbances and secessions in communities. So some wise guy left a comment on one of my videos and was asking, well, that wasn't a wise guy comment, but the other part was. Anyway, he asked me if hunting was considered a disturbance. And that's probably a little bit of a complicated question, but I would say in general, no, hunting is not considered a disturbance because when humans hunt, right, and they take out deer or bear or whatever, that is us filling the role of a top consumer or a top predator, right? A top consumer. So those are roles that we've actually eliminated by eliminating things like wolves and things like that. So because of that, we're kind of doing the ecosystem a favor by filling in that role. Anyway, what is a disturbance then, if that's not what a disturbance is? A disturbance is an episode that damages communities, at least temporarily, destroying organisms and altering the availability of resources. So basically, something big, bad, and temporary, right? Floods, fires, droughts, storms, volcanic erosions, I don't know, the tsunamis, right? Anything you can think of that's big and destructive and not permanent. Um, so your book does point out though that some small scale natural disturbances do have a positive effect on the community. Oh shoot, I went 10 minutes past, guys. Let me see who's still on because you get extra credit. Actually, man, let's just say this: the last word for attendance, and if you get these, and I'll look to see who was on longer. The last word for attendance is extra credit. I'm so sorry I kept you guys late. I'm not used to doing this, so thank you guys for staying late. All of you who stayed late will get extra credit. So when you send in those keywords, make sure you remind me that you stayed late. And I hope you have a great week. And I apologize for going over. And now I'm just going to stay on for office hours.